Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with LISAEVERS.
Welcome to this episode of Street Soldiers. I'm LISAEVERS. We're calling it ceasefire. How do we stop the shootings? Gun violence is up not just in New York, but in many cities around the country, and it's claiming more and more innocent lives. The question is why? While the debate over what's causing it rages on, the call for solutions is becoming even more urgent. The sound of gunshots is becoming much more common in the city, and innocent victims like one-year-old baby DeVell Gardner Jr. are getting caught in the crossfire far too often. I spoke with NYPD Chief Jeffrey Madry, who says this cannot and will not go on.
There has to be a call to arms. We can't let our city, we can't let our communities continuously be shot up. We cannot live through this kind of gun violence. We can't go back to those days ever again.
17-year-old high school basketball star Brandon Hendricks was another innocent victim. It's a loss his mother, Eve Hendricks, says she will never get over.
That's the worst part, knowing he will never walk through that door again, knowing I will never see that smile, I will never hear that voice, knowing he's not there. He's not here.
No one plays basketball anymore on the big court at the Andrew Jackson houses, where Brandon Hendricks was a daily presence. It's now a memorial to the incredible teen who inspired and uplifted so many with the hope of success and a better life. His murder wounded the very souls of the young men who were close to him.
Literally everything I do, he'll be with me. So it was it's still rough. I'm still not processing that he's not here with me anymore, and I can't see him again.
This situation right here messed up the whole neighborhood. Everybody's sad. It's not the same without him at all. It's not the same.
It scarred me in a way that I think can never be healed.
Graduate student Francisco Infante was like a big brother to Brandon and says he's devastated.
Hopefully this motivates a lot of people to necessarily come together, build that unity that's needed, and love each other every day, because that's what Brandon was about. He was about unity, he was about love. So I just want us to continue his work in his honor. Everyone
you're about to hear from is closely involved with this issue. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me is Aisha Sekou. She's a founder and CEO of Street Corner Resources. Aisha, great to have you with us.
It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for staying on top of the issue of gun violence.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Also joining us is Dr. Darren Porter. He's a former NYPD lieutenant and criminal justice professor. Darren, great to have you with us again.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Marky. He's the host of Black News 102. It's a news channel on YouTube, and he was also formerly incarcerated, and he's currently working with youth on the streets. Marky, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much. Aisha, let me start with you on this. In terms of the street violence, you have been fighting this good fight for a very, very long time. What do you see happening this summer? Why is this so different?
You know, the fight has been long and steady, and we have had, and I want people to be hopeful, because we had a surge of violence in the 90s, and then we saw it break down in the early 2000s, and then now we're seeing an uptick again. And so that means that it is possible for us to create peace in our community, because we've had it, right? But the uptick that we see now, I think, has a lot to do with the stress level of what's going on right now with COVID-19, the quarantine, people being unemployed. And I think that even the gambling that's allowed in our community, that was kind of broken up before now. Those games would be broken up, because we know that those games end in violence often, because of people betting with no money, what they call betting, that kind of thing. And people are involved in some things that maybe before COVID, they had not been involved in. We see people coming out of
desperation and boredom and whatever. Darren, what is so different about this summer?
Well, I think it's multi-layered. We have to look at the first component in a lack of police resources in the communities. That proves to be a significant component, because we no longer have the staffing that we've had in the past to address these issues of gun violence that are plaguing the communities of color in particular. The second component, there's been somewhat of an anti-police sentiment in connection with the death of George Floyd. So there's been somewhat of a state of acrimony that's been plaguing us as New Yorkers. So when we look at the groundswell that's attached to the death of George Floyd, coupled with the lack of resources within a police department, the culmination of two has set forth a precedent that's resulted in gun violence that's plaguing the communities of color and the city of New York as a result.
Marky, in terms of what you see happening on the streets, tell us what you see happening as you go around. You film these different events. You're at these community events, and where some of these tragedies are happening. What are you seeing?
Well, I believe that there's no communication between the police force and our communities. I believe that the police is basically just coming through the communities, watching what's going on, and just doing a little drive-by. I believe that if they communicated with the kids and with our community much more, that it can bring down, the tension between not only the police department, but also between the different blocks or gangs or things that's going on with our community.
Darren, what about that? You guys feel free to jump in, please. Darren, what do you say to that about the police? Because we've seen them recently. They're starting these family days. They're doing town halls with the community. They're trying to be out there more in a non-enforcement capacity. What do you see about that?
I do agree with Mark in connection with the lack of communication between police and community. That police and community relationship should be symbiotic. There should be a seamless transition of information that flows into police departments. But in the wake of the current state of acrimony that's plaguing the city, there's since been a closing of the borders, so to speak. The communities have somewhat closed ranks on the dissemination of information of the police. The police are somewhat feel as if they're under siege, and the lack of communication between the two entities is growing a greater propensity for violence. We have 8.5 million New Yorkers that live in the city of New York. However, we only have a police department of 38,000 sworn officers. 38,000 sworn officers can in no way, shape, or form do the job to protect that community or the communities of a whole of New York. Therefore, it's necessary that we gather the intelligence from the communities. And I believe that just based on the state of acrimony, we've closed the corridors on both sides.
That conversation. Aisha, you were part of the effort. You led the effort as the Harlem Outpost for the Cure Violence, the citywide Cure Violence movement, to try to take over certain street corners to let people know the gun violence wouldn't be tolerated. But how is it possible to actually deal with the problem if people don't want to work with the police?
I'll tell you, Lisa, as you know, we've been occupying the corners since about 2005, kind of off and on as needed, but most consistently over the last 6 years. And so one of the things that we've seen in terms of police and community relationships is that the police will present one image in the daylight, and in the night, and on these back streets, and sometimes not even the back streets, on the main boulevards, 7 Lenox Ave, Malcolm X Boulevard, and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, and other boulevards here that are named after black men would be beat down by the police. You cannot expect to fix a gushing wound with a Band-Aid. So jumping double dutch and playing basketball and having a party is not the answer to better policing. What is the answer to better policing? Really looking at what are the things and who are the people creating the problem. All of those officers who are creating the problem, who have been beating on people, whether in plain clothes or in blue uniform, need to be pulled. Their jackets need to be, or fouled, need to be gone, and we need to remove them from the community. If they don't want to serve the community that they are in, they should be taken out. The improvement of the community comes with, we had, the other night we occupied, and where they were thinking a high-level barbecue was gonna happen because it was on Instagram. There's an officer, Altaveri, and I have to give the props where the props are due. He stayed in communication about moving cars. I asked him not to have the police come out of the vehicles into the cookout, since the cookout was being allowed, as long as it was under control and there was no criminal activity going on, then to let people just be. I talked to the OGs was holding the ground. They said, we got this. And together we kept a peaceful cookout.
There's much more to come. Stay with us. Darren, in terms of the pressures on the police right now, give us the police perspective from that, from the other side, from officers, where they've been, after weeks and weeks and weeks and months of protests, being in the center of it. Some officers cross the line. There's much faster discipline, but what's the whole mood of the police? Because there's a lot of talk on the streets about cops not enforcing the laws the way that they used to when it's needed.
Well, in the climate of police reform, there's been several components of legislation that have been introduced in connection with receding police officers' ability to produce or partake in certain enforcement activities. One of the things that recently came to fruition is the diaphragm bill. It was specifically focused on a chokehold. However, it became far more abstract, and it didn't just focus on a specific part of placing pressure to one's larynx. It now held an officer accountable on a criminal level if he or she was to touch a person's diaphragm. The diaphragm is merely the area that goes north of the waistline. So if an officer touches someone's chest, if an officer touches someone's back, then that officer can be held criminally liable in a criminal court.
So are you saying that you believe that a lot of the cops that are out on the street, if they can avoid a situation or getting involved in a situation, they're going to avoid it right now?
Well, I was just kind of going through the culmination as to where the morale is. Officers in many cases feel that they are taking the appropriate action, but if they were to use force against someone's chest, they would subsequently be disciplined in a court of law. I believe that the majority of officers want to do the right thing, but they're kind of building the plane as they learn how to fly it in the wake of the recent legislation. And so I think there's more of a training issue that's coming to the forefront and how officers can effectively adapt to the new provisions that have been introduced.
Aisha, I want to get your take on that because you look like you're not buying that.
Right, I'm not. Brother Porcher, all respect due, but the bottom line is that you know that it's illegal to choke somebody. We had to get legislation to ban it, but it is illegal. And a lot of the behavior on the part of the police, I've filmed it, I've witnessed it, I've worked with young people who were part of it, who've had that kind of violence come toward them. I think that basically the police need to do a better scrutiny, psychological scrutiny on the officers, that it's not just because you want to be a police, your father was a police officer, your grandfather was one, and now you become one. Actually, what happens is that same behavior is fed into the police department over and over again, because usually the behavior is learned from your parent and it trickles down. So what I'm saying is that we need to do a better job of who we bring into the precinct and who is governing certain communities. If everybody comes from Long Island, there's no investment in that community.
But I gotta cut. The police department today is much more diverse than it was, and there's many more city residents on the force.
Yeah, but when
I'm not just saying that from statistics, but I'm saying that from
that's
stories and being out, in all these different areas.
It's not enough. And when you spread that out across the city, it's very few officers in terms of diversity. That when they showed up in the park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon to shut down an anti-violence event that I was doing with little kids tap dancing and cotton candy and all of that, it was mainly white officers and about 2 black officers and 1 Latino. And the black officer was really the one coming for me. I'm just saying that we have to be better as a city to find the right people, the right mix to serve a particular community. It's not just push them out into a community. Officers need to be aware of where they're going, what is the sentiment.
And the culture. The
challenge, know the food, know the people's way of being. That women like me, we talk with our hands and put our hands on our hip. It does not mean that we're being aggressive. This is how we talk. So I think that knowing the culture and understanding the culture of the diverse communities we have is so key, so key.
Mark, I want to start with you on this. What you hear on the streets, when you are out there, and especially as you're talking to the people that they're just out living on the streets and making their money off the streets, where are they saying these guns are coming from?
I mean, the guns is already in the community. The guns been here for years. It's not like it's something that's new. That the guns is coming from everywhere. They coming from the gun stores. They coming from out of town. Everyone knows where the guns are coming from. The police know where the guns are coming from. We're not making it in Harlem. We're not making them in Brooklyn. They got to come from somewhere else, someone with a legal license in order to get the weapons. But I just want to piggyback off of what the sister said, because I was a victim of police brutality. And I know what it is to be out there, to have a police put his knee on my neck, put his knee in my back, to say I can't breathe. I said I couldn't breathe years ago. Many of us young brothers said we couldn't breathe, and the police continue to beat us and stomp us out and choke us even more. I guess is that they got this authority. Once you get this authority, you start to feel like it's us against them. And that's what's happening now. I think they need to go through a more psychological thing with the police officers when they're hiring them, because they can act one way in front of you or act one way when they in the office. But when they come on these streets, it's like they just crazy. It's a whole different thing.
Darren, what about that? What about that? What our guests are talking about, that, you know, the police can put on the smile and shake hands during the daytime, but then when it comes down to getting out on the streets, it's a very different thing. And I just want to give this some context too, because the stop and frisk has gone way, way down from what it was. Even before this whole COVID thing started, the number of people arrested was way down. Complaints, police brutality complaints were showing a decline. But what do you see this coming from?
Well, one of the things I want to speak to what the gentleman mentioned in terms of the psychological component, all officers go through a psychological process prior to becoming members of the department. I think that process has not been revolutionized accordingly. I think that we're using a system that's somewhat antiquated and it needs to be revitalized. Now, in connection with you being the victim of a level of police use of force, I believe that police reform is the purview that we're looking for in connection with changing the dynamic of citizens being victimized by police. I was a lieutenant in the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau. So in many instances, I investigated cases of misconduct. In no way, shape, or form should an officer have the right to abuse a person that's being taken into custody. We are experiencing record low numbers of people that are being incarcerated as of lately. However, I don't think it adds up to the violence, because we're clearly experiencing a meteoric rise in violence in the city. That doesn't mean that we can arrest our way out of the situation, but we need to look through the purview of taking these illegal weapons off of the street. One of the ways that these guns come into the city of New York is through something we refer to as the iron pipeline. This is where people purchase guns through straw purchases. When I use the term straw purchase, as you mentioned earlier, sir, this is when someone that is
like a front person.
Right. They will legally acquire a firearm in a state like Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, and they will bring those guns into the city of New York and they'll sell them illegally. New York City has the toughest gun laws in the country, next to Chicago and Los Angeles. But how is it that the cities that have the toughest gun laws in the country have the greatest propensity for gun violence? Right. So
let's come back to that. But Aisha, this piece about a lot of changes happened in January with the criminal justice reform. Some people in the community have said to me, well, you know what, Lisa? The criminal justice system basically came to a halt. There have been hundreds of arrests of people for gun possession, but they're still on the street. So whoever they were beefing with, they're in fear. They have to get a gun because they're afraid of getting shot. And it just continues to escalate. What do you think about that?
Well, you know, I've heard a lot of talk about bail reform and criminal justice reform contributing to the increase in violence. I don't believe that that's the sole reason for the increase. It may have some, we may see some repeat offenders, but I also think it has a lot to do with there was not a plan to provide oversight for those people who were released during this time of COVID. So it is easy to point at that when no provision of oversight has been made. Usually when someone is re-entering society, even when it's a weak plan, a plan is made. This is where you're going to live. They make sure that they're not living in a house with other felons. They make sure that they're not going back into a place that's unsafe. And even if they didn't do this perfectly, there was some plan and someone to make sure that they had oversight.
Try to network them with some of the re-entry organizations.
Right. So since COVID, there was no real plan. And a lot of folks were released without that. Some with no place to live. Start there. So someone who is put back into society without what they need, what they do is they oftentimes will go back to what they know because they don't have any other measure to resort to. But I don't want to just blame it on those who are re-entering, because I believe that that's a very, very small portion. I think that when crime is happening and the people who are supposed to oversee it in a certain way or do something about it look the other way, and the brothers in the street will tell us, oh, the police said we could rock, we could do this, we could do that. And I get that. But we can't let criminal activity happen at the expense of the entire community.